So that brings us to the next thing that I want to talk about for scientific terms. So remember, we reviewed common names and scientific names, and then we talked about some structural features, and that was very much related to those observations you took about your plants and animals and what they looked like. The next thing I want to talk about is adaptation. Can everyone say that? Adaptation. Adaptation. So an adaptation would be something that a plant or an animal has that helps it to survive. So let's think about that for a second. Helps it to survive. What could be some examples of things that a plant or an animal might have to help it survive? I'll give you a second to think about that. Good thinking. Sometimes when we take a little bit of time and we rack our brains really hard, we can come up with some great ideas. So we're thinking about an adaptation, something that might help an animal to survive. I'm going to give you some examples. I did a little bit of extra research on some of these plants and animals that I saw and talked about in our observations and in our science lessons. So the yellow cedar. Yellow cedars are very resistant to water. And I think we talked about that a little bit, but they like to live in areas that have very moist ground and a lot of water around them. And that's why they do so well here where we live, because we get a lot of rain. So they do really, really well in this type of habitat. So you remember that a habitat is where something lives and what's around it. So a yellow cedar lives in a very wet and a moist environment. They like the water. So one adaptation that this yellow cedar has, and that it has evolved into over the hundreds and thousands of years that yellow cedars have been around, is that adaptation to be able to resist water. So yellow cedars can live more than 100 years, and all of that water that's around them doesn't break them down. So most other trees and most other types of wood will start to rot, and they'll start to break apart and break down when they get really wet. Yellow cedars don't do that. So that is an adaptation of a yellow cedar tree, is that it has a high resistance to water. And that's one of the things that helps to make it great for using those cedars to make things like canoes or paddles, because those go in the water, and yellow cedars are very resistant to water. So that's one example of an adaptation. Another example for a dandelion. So if you ever walked around in a field or gone for a walk down the street or a hike and seen a lot of dandelions, there are tons of them around right now. So if you keep your eye open, I bet you can see some. But an adaptation that a dandelion has is that when it gets cold and it gets rainy, instead of that flower being open where you can see all of those yellow petals, it actually closes up. So it almost goes back into a bud-like form, and it will close up, and you'll see almost a light greenish color all around the outside of the flower. That's because it's cold. It's a way for this dandelion to protect itself when it gets cold out. So if you know a little bit about our weather around here, sometimes we get some really hot, warm heat waves where it'll be really warm for 3 or 4 or 5 days in the springtime. But then, even 1 week later, it can get really cold again. So in order for a dandelion to stay alive and to keep flourishing and growing when it gets cold, that's what it does. It closes up really, really tightly to keep itself warm. I think a good example of that was our very first parade that Sardis Elementary did. And some of you very, very brave students were out there in the rain and the snow and the hail, and it was such a stormy day when it was only a few days before or after that it had been nice and sunny outside. So dandelions protect themselves by closing up when it's cold, and then when it gets warm and sunny, they open back up again to absorb all of the light from that sunshine. Pretty cool. Next up, we have the robin. So robins will migrate in the wintertime. Robins don't like it when it gets really cold either. And migration is an adaptation. Oh my, that's a tongue twister. Migration is an adaptation. So when robins feel that it's getting cold outside, they will flock together with a bunch of other robins, and they will fly probably down as far as California, so quite a ways. They will fly to where it's warmer weather, and they'll build a nest, and they'll live in that warmer climate with the warmer weather for the entire winter season. And then when it starts to get warmer in the springtime, like right now, those robins fly back home. So that's why we have so many robins around right now, is because it's just getting warmer and we're starting to see them again, and all the birds are coming out. So in order to be able to survive the winter, when it gets cold, robins fly south. Flying south is called migration. So when they fly south, it's to keep warm in the wintertime so that they can live all winter and then fly back home to here in the springtime when it gets warmer. Because that's a way that robins live and survive, it is an adaptation. The last one we're going to talk about is our ladybug. So ladybugs have an adaptation too. And you'll remember I talked about how ladybugs are red. Well, red is a really bright color. And a lot of animals that are trying to protect themselves from predators, so maybe they don't like it if a bird comes and eats them. They don't want to get eaten. So they will have bright colors. And those bright colors are seen as a warning to other animals that they might be poisonous and they aren't very tasty to eat. So to try and help themselves not get eaten by things like birds, ladybugs have a bright red color to try and warn those other animals to stay away and not to eat them. Pretty interesting, hey? So we've learned about quite a few things while we've been studying science in these lessons, and we've been looking at plants and animals. All of those observations that you did helped you to be able to notice different things about those plants and animals. And a lot of that relates to those structural features. So when you notice things about the plants and animals, you can start to better understand how those plants and how those animals live. So those observations are really important. We also looked at the common name and the scientific name. So common name is what we call it, and that's what it's best known by. The scientific name is usually a long, difficult to pronounce name, but it allows scientists to know for sure that if something is classified by its scientific name, and you know for sure that that's what it is, then no other animal anywhere in the world can be called that name unless it meets all of the criteria to be that animal. So scientists don't have any doubles or repeats of names. Everything has its own individual scientific name. And the last thing we talked about was adaptations. Adaptations. So you've got scientific and common names, structural features, that's what it looks like, and then you have the adaptation. And those are things that plants and animals have to help it survive. So the cedar tree is resistant to water. That's an adaptation. The dandelion closes when it's cold. That's an adaptation. The robin flies south to keep warm in the winter. Adaptation. And the ladybug has red on its wing coverings to help warn other animals not to eat it, to help it stay alive. Another adaptation. You have learned so much with all of our observations for science. And I'm really excited about how hard you guys have been working, how much you have learned, and all of the effort that you've put into it. That's what makes your brains grow so big and makes you so smart. So thank you for doing science with me. It's been such a pleasure. And good luck with all your future observations about animals. Go outside, have some walks, go for some hikes, and start to observe everything that's around you to see what else you can learn.